Doug Crawford-Brown. I'm director of the Cambridge Center for Climate Change Mitigation Research, professor emeritus back in the United States and now a professor here at the University of Cambridge. And my role is facilitating the Cambridge Retrofit project over the 2012 period and then eventually handing it off to some sort of public-private entity that'll be created. So Cambridge Retrofit has the aim of retrofitting essentially every building in Cambridge over the next 30 to 40 years. I say essentially because we may not do King's Chapel or something like that, but essentially every building will be retrofit. And the aim, therefore, is to reduce the carbon emissions in the city of Cambridge, to make the city of Cambridge the first city to reach the Climate Change Act commitments of the UK, and then to use that as a template for the way in which these actions would go on in every other city of the UK. The retrofitting process is one in which you take an existing building, which probably was built with energy not even in mind when it was designed and constructed, and bring that building up to an energy efficiency standard so it looks a lot like the modern buildings that are being developed for codes for sustainable homes and other strategies here in the UK. Okay, so on the issue of what kinds of actions we take in Cambridge Retrofit, they fall into just three categories. We change the walls and the ceilings and the windows and so forth to be more energy efficient. We bring in better boilers and cooling systems for the buildings and replacing energy inefficient refrigerators and washer dryers and so forth with modern versions of those which have significantly higher energy efficiency. The overall goal for these kinds of projects and their impacts on climate change is to reduce the emissions in a city by 80% by 2050. And our estimate is that if you look at a city like Cambridge, we could get about a third of the way to that goal by the retrofit project. You also would have to have new green energy brought in. You have to deal with your transport system. But we're talking about getting a third of the way to the UK commitment to an 80% reduction. I'll also say that in the process of doing that, one reduces energy bills by about the same amount. So we're talking about reducing energy bills in homes by 50 to 60%. We're asked quite often, why use Cambridge? Cambridge is so unrepresentative of the rest of the UK. We think Cambridge is the ideal place for it because if you're going to launch a program like this, you want it to have a reasonable chance of success. And if one tried to use London or Manchester, the sort of places where we know we have to go to eventually, those are just simply too complicated of a community. Cambridge is the ideal community. It has a committed population. It has a very small set of owners of the buildings because there is the university and the colleges and the city council, and it simply has the kind of innovations that are needed coming out of the spin-offs from the University of Cambridge, Anglia Ruskin and so forth to be able to support this kind of an effort. So, I mean, Cambridge is mentioned by the DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, as being sort of an ideal test case because it has a full range of buildings all the way from, let's say, 14th century to the 21st century, and therefore it's a very good test case for whether there is any particular century of buildings in which one can't do these retrofits or whether it's possible to do the retrofits across the whole building estate. Our contention is we can do a building built in any year. This is an immense project. It involves, let's say, 50,000 buildings, just as an average number. It involves probably £1 billion worth of investment over the next 40 years. And in order to make a big project like this work, one has to have everybody at the table who is part of the delivery process. So on April 18th of 2012, we had the launch event for Cambridge Retrofit. The idea of the launch event was to bring together everybody that we knew was going to have to be involved in the delivery of Cambridge Retrofit, and to have an event in which we weren't preaching to the choir anymore. We didn't simply have the people who believed in climate change, the people who were interested in sustainability. We had the hard-nosed business types, the planners, English heritage, and so forth at the table to begin to understand what the barriers were to implementing something like Cambridge Retrofit and how we were going to get around those barriers.
It can be achieved, it must be achieved. I don't see any alternative. It's just how we get there that is in question, and I think just gathering together people from lots of different disciplines means that we have a greater chance of succeeding.
I think the retrofit of Cambridge is a vast project, but absolutely obtainable. and with financial packages that are currently available, it's, I would say, relatively easy to achieve. The piece that isn't easy is the regulation, procurement, and the mixture of public and private sector that you have to overcome. We've got to get a teamwork together, and you've got to all believe in one common goal.
I think there are a huge number of obstructions, and I think we've been over, 4 hours of workshops today talking about them. There is certainly an issue about a huge number of historic buildings that need to be renovated, need to be refurbished, but also need to preserve their architectural significance. There are an awful lot of fairly old houses owned by private landlords and owner-occupiers, and there's really no mechanism for motivating the owners to do any work on them.
I think the funding is an issue, but I think there are a number of opportunities in the market to fund it, recognising that yes, it is a difficult time for the public sector in particular, and local authorities have a number of challenges around where their finance comes from. But actually there's a lot of market money available, there's a lot of cash moving into sustainability and energy efficiency. I think what we need to have is mobilised projects, and I think the funding will come.
I think the next step is for the larger organisations here to really scale up their own retrofit projects. The university particularly, the City Council is already doing quite a lot of retrofit in its own buildings and, signposting other schemes. So I think that the big organisations need to scale up what they're doing, continue to create exemplar projects, and to try and draw other organisations into it until there's a critical mass.
So the launch have identified a number of barriers and obstacles that are certainly going to arise. We knew those barriers and obstacles going in because many of us work part-time in the commercial sphere, so we've delivered on large projects like this before. But what became clear was two things. Number one, there are significant barriers to this. This is a larger program than has ever been done in a city like Cambridge, but that there are ways to get around some of these barriers by what we call the quid pro quo approach. So the idea here would be that a developer, for example, might not be willing to do certain things in buildings if they thought that it was going to take a long time to get planning permission, but now the planning authorities can come in and say, well, if you're willing to do the following sets of things, we're going to give you an expedited, not a circumvention of planning, but an expedited planning process. So what came out of the day was an understanding of every one of the barriers that we're going to confront, what sort of incentives the various players are going to need in order to move forward on this, and who can provide those incentives, who is willing to provide those incentives. So I think the message on the day was quite a positive one, very large challenge, but the kind of challenge that has been faced before in the commercial and the public sector, the kind of challenge we can face here and meet here in Cambridge.